In the previous part of this project, I got as far as completing the cockpit. In this episode, I'm going to be completing the landing gear bays before I can move on to other things. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minute, and join me on the workbench for the second part of the DBMK Sea Fury in 1/32 scale. With the cockpit complete, there are a few little bits and pieces I need to do before I can actually get to the gear bays, but before that, let's just put a list of the products I used during this particular stage of the build, just to give you an idea of the kind of things you might need to go and get. But there's not a great deal because I won't actually be doing any painting in this particular part. Without any further ado, let's get into it. So first up, I'm going to be adding the various small parts which make up the rear tail wheel support strut. If I remember correctly, the entire tail wheel and bay assembly consists of 11 parts, and was pretty fiddly. Don't get me wrong, the level of detail in this kit is particularly impressive, and the parts are reproduced rather finely with only a hint of flash in a few places. I did find it a little bit fiddly getting all these little bits in the right places though, and this is kind of a theme for this entire build. A steady hand and careful application of glue is essential to get the parts in the right places. Building up the tail wheel bay, there are various elements which need to be glued on, such as little bulkheads and things. And then finally, when you've made this kind of cage, you can add the tail wheel support strut. I won't actually add the wheel at this point, I'll leave it off until after some painting, which will come much later in the build. So this tail wheel bay was then glued into one of the fuselage halves, and I'm almost ready to join the fuselage halves together. Before I do this though, I do need to insert the engine exhaust pipes inside of part of the cowling. This will be done for both sides, as the steps are repeated. These parts of the cowling can then be glued onto the fuselage halves. I think here it's worth just pointing out that I did notice a very small short shot on one of the cowling flaps. You can see here the toothpick pointing at it, and whilst it's quite minor and I don't think I will bother doing anything to rectify it, I hope that mine is an isolated case and is not indicative of the entire production run. Turning the fuselage halves over, there is this small component which needs to be glued in, and then a larger kind of cage which acts as a support brace but also helps to kind of block in the cowling area. There is a central part to the engine as well. An engine representation is provided. I know that there is a 3D printed part which you could get separately to represent the engine cowling open to see engine detail, but that's not included in the kit. Instead you get this engine representation which can be glued into the fuselage halves. I would say just take a moment here to make sure you get this the correct way up. As far as I know, the two sort of supporting brackets which make almost like a W shape should be pointing towards the top of the aircraft. It's not indicated in the instructions, the orientation, and it could have been handy on the part to have like an arrow on the back pointing the direction it should be orientated. With that done though, the fuselage halves would be joined together. The fit is generally quite good, but I would run my sanding stick down the seams just to tidy them up a little bit. The top of the nose can now be added as well. Again, the fit is generally okay here, but the way that DBMK designed this does mean that there is a seam we need to address. Some Ammo MIG putty surfacer in medium consistency would be painted along the seam. This is mentioned in the instructions and is supposedly a result of the injection moulding process. This seam was not present on the aircraft, this was a single piece of cowling. So I filled it in and then sanded it as smooth as I could get it. DBMK have indicated where there should be some rivets, but not filled in the entire panel. So I'm going to use this B-Izzy riveting tool in 1mm size. I do actually have the double wheel here, as I don't have a single, so because I only need to run in one line of rivets at a time, I'll actually hold the riveting tool at an angle so only one wheel engages with the plastic. Using the rivets which have been moulded into the surface detail as a starter to indicate where they should go, I rolled the riveting tool along the surface to try and replicate where the rivets should be. I think despite the fact that I don't have a single wheel riveting tool, this has come out reasonably okay. I guess it remains to be seen how this looks after I've done some painting much later in the build. And it's at this point that the fuselage is in its most basic form and I can move on to the landing gear bays proper. So the first steps for the landing gear bays are to build up the kind of panels or sidewalls which form the structure of the landing gear bay. There are a variety of small parts which need to be added onto these side walls. Once again, this is an exercise in patience as this is incredibly fiddly. With 2 of these walls now complete, I would move on to the large front wall of the bay. Again, there are loads of small parts which need to be added onto here. I think in total there are around 70 parts which build up the main landing gear bay. As I mentioned in the previous part of this build, this is a little bit like hunt the part. So you get 10 sprues included in the kit, and for this stage of the build, you're going to be hunting for the ones that you want on 5 of the sprues. This definitely slows down the build process and took up quite a bit of time. So the central wall of the gear bay, which splits it into its 2 halves, does have a number of components which need to be glued onto it. But you will notice there are lots of little pin marks which are moulded into the surface. These are indications of where some wires can be added. And you are given a wiring diagram, but it's not to scale, which I would have preferred because you could cut the wires to shape and the correct size before adding them onto the part. It was pretty much a trial and error endeavour. I did originally start by using 0.2mm silver wire and supergluing it into the surface. However, I found that to be incredibly tricky. So what I actually ended up doing was stretching some sprue to make very thin plastic wires, and would instead use these and plastic cement to replicate the wiring. Again, at this point I just want to mention that there is a very small short shot on the bottom part of this central brace. Once again, I don't really see the point in doing anything to this because this is going to be flush against the surface of the landing gear bay and probably not going to be noticeable in the finished build. But it is a little bit frustrating that in this particular video I have noticed 2 areas of the kit which weren't perhaps moulded to their best quality. So these wires then. Following the wiring diagram in the instructions, I glued in the different lengths of wire and tried to form them and bend them around the different areas to get them to look kind of about right. I don't know how accurate I probably was with this, but it seems to be okay. I think that given that there are those little pin marks in the surface of both sides of this part, and you do actually need to add the wires to both sides, and you can't drill these little marks out because they're not symmetrical on both sides, or at least they didn't appear to be. So they do become a little bit noticeable. It almost looks like termites have been eating the I would say woodwork, but it's actually, I think it would be metal. So to hide them, I thought that adding the wires would be the best case. All in, this part of the build took me, I had to do it over 2 days because it was just too time consuming, and it was like between 2 and 3 hours per side to get all the wires in place. I spent more time working on this plastic part than I have on some of the kits that I've built in the past. So with that all done, I think it looks pretty good. I'm quite happy with the level of detail, but the sad thing of course is once you've completed the kit, and from a normal viewing angle, none of this is going to be visible. So if you're building this one, you need to ask yourself, is it worth the time and effort? Now I can start adding all these elements actually on to the wing surface where the landing gear bay is. There are a number of panels and flat pieces which have to be glued in, and then I can start adding the walls, which I've already added all of those details to. The fit is pretty good, everything locates quite positively, and because we're now working with bigger parts, the progress here was a little quicker. But progress is going to slow down a little bit because there are loads of support struts which need to be added onto all the various parts, and then some more wires, tubes and other pipe work. There was an awful lot of parts that had to go into this landing gear bay. As I mentioned earlier, there's around 70 parts here. All in, I think this took me just over 3 days, closer to 4 days to get all of this done, and I was actually becoming a bit burnt out with having to do all these small and fiddly parts. It just didn't feel like you were making any progress because you were still working on one very specific area of the model kit. There are some little bits of photo etch which need to be added as well. There is a red kind of tap part which goes here. I'm probably going to paint the whole landing gear bay in one colour and then pick out this one again in red afterwards. But that doesn't bring us to the end. There's still loads of little details which we need to add, various pipes and other elements. But it did eventually get to the point where we were coming to the end of the landing gear bays. On the main sort of front wall there is like the actuators for the landing gear legs to raise and lower, so these various elements have to be added, and then finally the last part to add was a little bit of photo etch, which I kind of bent to more or less the right size or shape, and then I popped it where I think it needed to go. The instructions weren't entirely clear. I do find the instructions a little bit tricky to read at times because in some places the part will be already drawn onto the diagram with just an arrow labeling it, whereas others are separate and exploded, showing you that they are going to add on. So it can be a little bit of a where does this bit go exactly, and these small photo etch parts was definitely one of those. The landing gear bays are pretty much complete at this point, so my final step was just to add the edges of the wings where the folding mechanism would be. I'm not going to do my wings folded, I'm going to do mine extended. So there are loads of other details and things that you would need to add for the folded wing, but naturally I'm probably going for the slightly easier option of having the wings extended. But I do quite like my aircraft to be almost ready to take off. So these panels are put in the correct places, and I just want to mention the fact that I found another typo. In the previous video I found a typo which confused me, but in this one there is a second typo, which kind of meant you had a 50-50 chance of getting it right. So when adding these panels to the sides of the wing, E18 is listed twice, but actually I think the second one is E17, at least that's what I did. I find it a little bit strange that I've encountered a couple of typos now, which I would have thought would have been picked up during the test builds of this kit. It's not unusual for typos to creep into model kit instructions, but I am a little surprised that I've encountered two. Hopefully though, this will be the last of them and I won't see any more. And with that, I'm going to call this part of my project complete. So yeah, this is where I'm up to at the moment. My landing gear bays are now complete, and the fuselage is in its most basic format. Hopefully in the next episode I should be starting to add these various elements together and actually getting this to look more like a Sea Fury. A quick little summary, I think, of this part of the build is that it was very time consuming. I had hoped to make quicker progress than I did, and this took between 3 and 4 days just to get the landing gear bay complete. A little bit disappointed with those short shots that I encountered, but they are very tiny, so I don't see the point in doing anything to them. Also, the typos that I've encountered did throw me a little, but I think I've managed to overcome them just by taking a bit of extra time to figure out which part needed to go where. And I think that's the main takeaway from this kit, is that this is a big time sink. If you really enjoy putting lots of little fiddly pieces inside of your models, then this is perfect for you. In the context of value, you're going to get an awful lot of time spent on this particular project. Personally though, I would have liked to have made progress a little bit quicker, and I hope that the next stages of the build do flow a little bit nicer. So make sure you join me as I progress with this DBMK Hawker Sea Fury in 1/32 scale. Don't forget that we do have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to join the Model Club, check out the links in the description. Massive thanks to these guys on screen for the extra support they give the channel. And if you'd like to join them and get exclusive access to early videos and other perks, full information is below the video. There are other ways to help support the channel if you'd prefer, but the best way to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.